Among the many knights who sat at the round table, few carried as much triumph and tragedy as Sir Tristan. He was more than just a warrior. He was a prince, a poet, a musician, a lover, and a man who became both a legend and a warning. His name is forever tied to Isolde, the woman who was meant to be his queen, though fate had other plans. Their love was forbidden. Their story was woven with betrayal, passion, and destiny. Unlike the grand victories of Arthur or the noble quests of Galahad, Tristan's tale is one of sorrow. He was a knight who won great battles, but lost the one thing he desired most. He was a man who followed duty, yet was undone by his own heart. This is the story of Sir Tristan, the tragic knight of Arthurian legend. Tristan's story begins before he ever held a sword or played a song. His life, from the very moment of his birth, was shadowed by sorrow. He was the son of King Rivalin of Lyonesse and Queen Blanchefleur, a union that should have promised a bright future. But fate had other plans. His father was a warrior king, a man of steel and duty, and his mother, Blanchefleur, was known throughout the lands for her beauty and grace. Yet neither of them would see their son grow into the legend he would become. Shortly after Tristan was born, his mother died, not in battle, not of sickness, but from heartbreak. Whether it was the strain of childbirth or the crushing weight of love lost, her passing left an emptiness in the newborn prince's life before he was even old enough to understand it. His father, though a great ruler, was not the kind of man to raise a child. Consumed by his own grief, Rivalin distanced himself, leaving Tristan in the care of his loyal retainers and lords. The boy was loved, raised among the noble courts of Lyonesse, but he grew up knowing that something was missing. That absence of a mother's warmth, of a father's steady hand, shaped him in ways no one could predict. Despite his tragic beginnings, Tristan was no brooding, bitter child. He was bright, quick-witted, and unnaturally gifted in many things. While other boys of noble birth focused solely on swordplay and knightly discipline, Tristan seemed to master everything he touched. His tutors were astonished at how fast he learned. He wielded a sword as if he had been born with one in his hand, but he could just as easily pick up a harp and make it sing. He spoke with the grace of a poet, moved with the agility of a dancer, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that set him apart. Yet, for all his talent, there was always something distant about him, something unspoken behind his sharp blue eyes. Those who knew him best often said that even in his happiest moments, Tristan carried sadness like a cloak draped over his shoulders. The name he bore was a cruel joke played by fate. Tristan, derived from the word triste, meaning sorrow. It was a name he would live up to in ways he never could have imagined. As Tristan grew into a man, his features reflected the contradictions within him. He was tall and lean, built for speed and agility rather than brute strength. His golden brown hair fell in loose waves past his shoulders, wild yet effortless, much like the man himself. His eyes were piercing, blue like the sea before a storm, both mesmerizing and unreadable. Many women of the court admired him, but few truly knew him. He could be charming, even playful, when he wanted to be, but there was always something just out of reach, something he never gave away. Those who trained him often marveled at how naturally he moved, whether in battle or on the hunt. He did not fight with raw strength alone, nor did he rely purely on technique. He thought his way through every encounter, anticipating movements, using his opponent's force against them. He was not the kind of warrior who charged blindly into battle. Every step was calculated, every strike deliberate. He could disarm a man with a flick of his wrist, or cut him down in a single fluid motion. And yet, for all his skill, for all the battles he would one day win, there was something Tristan could never conquer: fate. No amount of strength or cunning could change the path that lay ahead of him. But for now he was still a prince, not yet a knight. His destiny had not yet been written. Lyonesse was still standing, his heart had not yet been broken, and the woman who would change his life forever had not yet crossed his path. The world was vast, and Tristan was ready to face it. But the world, as it turned out, had already decided what it would do with him. As he came of age, Tristan left Lyonesse behind, setting his sights on the court of his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. Cornwall was not the largest kingdom, nor the most powerful, but Mark was a fair and noble ruler, and Tristan, eager to prove himself, quickly became his most trusted knight. Mark saw in his nephew something special, not just strength, but intelligence, loyalty, and an almost unshakable sense of honor. The king welcomed him into his court, offering him a place of high regard among his knights. Tristan thrived in Cornwall. He won tournaments with ease, his name becoming legend among the nobility. He led Mark's armies into battle against raiders from distant shores, crushing them with tactical brilliance. No enemy could outmatch him, no rival could best him. He was the pride of Cornwall, the knight who never lost. But even a warrior as skilled as Tristan would eventually face a battle that would change everything. One day, a ship arrived from Ireland, carrying a warrior unlike any Tristan had faced before. Morholt, the champion of Ireland. He was no ordinary knight. A giant of a man, clad in black iron, Morholt was said to be invincible. His strength was the stuff of legend, his sword heavy enough to cleave a man in two with a single stroke. But he had not come for battle alone. He had come to demand tribute. Cornwall, he declared, owed Ireland a terrible price. Each year, King Mark was to send a dozen of his finest young men as slaves to Ireland, or suffer the wrath of war. No one in the court dared to oppose him. None had the strength or the courage to challenge him, except Tristan. He could not stand by and watch his uncle submit to such humiliation. He stepped forward and, without hesitation, challenged Morholt to single combat. The terms were clear. If Tristan won, Cornwall would be free of its burden. If he lost, the tribute would continue and Tristan's own life would be forfeit. The duel took place on an isolated island, far from the eyes of the court, a battlefield fit for only two men. The fight was brutal, the clash of steel echoing over the waves. Morholt fought with monstrous strength, his blows shaking the very ground. But Tristan was faster, lighter on his feet, moving like a shadow between the giant's strikes. He dodged, parried, waiting for the perfect moment, and when it came, he struck. His sword found its mark, slicing through Morholt's helmet, driving deep into his skull. The Irish warrior staggered, then fell, his life claimed by Tristan's blade. Cornwall was free. But victory came at a cost. During the fight, Morholt's blade had found Tristan's flesh. It was a small wound, barely more than a cut, but the weapon had been laced with poison. The pain crept through his veins, slow and insidious, eating away at his strength. By the time he returned to Cornwall, he was already dying. No healer in the kingdom could cure him. The poison lingered, festering, dragging him closer to death with each passing day. He could barely stand, let alone fight. With no other choice, Tristan made a desperate decision. He boarded a small ship and set sail alone, his body weak, his fate uncertain. He let the winds take him wherever they pleased, offering his life to the mercy of the sea. Tristan had drifted across the sea with no destination, his body weakened by the festering poison in his wound. Days passed and the waves carried him far from the shores of his homeland. Fever clung to him, turning his thoughts to shadows, his dreams filled with faces of the past. But fate had not abandoned him just yet. The tides pulled him to the shores of Ireland, the very kingdom of the man he had slain. He was found half dead, his body broken, his breath shallow. To the people who discovered him, he was just another nameless warrior lost to the sea, a mystery that might never be solved. But among them was a woman who would change his life forever. Isolde, Princess of Ireland. Isolde was unlike any woman Tristan had ever known. She was no sheltered noblewoman, waiting idly for suitors to flatter her with empty words. She was sharp-witted, bold, and fiercely intelligent. More than that, she was a healer, skilled in the arts of medicine and magic, trained to cure wounds that others deemed fatal. When she saw the wounded knight before her, she did not hesitate. She took him into her care, tending to his fever, cleansing the poison from his body. For days, Tristan drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in the haze of fever. He did not know where he was, did not know the hands that were saving him, but he felt her presence, like a warmth beside him, a voice in the dark. Slowly, his strength returned, his vision cleared, and the world came back into focus. And that was when he realized the danger he was in. He was in Ireland, in the home of the very people he had defied, and worse, he was being cared for by the niece of the man he had killed. He did not reveal his true identity. He couldn't. If Isolde knew who he really was, she would surely turn on him, and he was still too weak to defend himself. Instead, he claimed to be a nameless knight from a distant land, wounded in battle and lost at sea. Isolde did not question him, at least not at first. Perhaps she suspected something. Perhaps she simply chose not to press. Either way, she continued to heal him, and as she did, something unspoken grew between them. Tristan had never met a woman like her. She did not simper or fawn, nor did she shrink beneath his gaze. She met him as an equal, challenging him with her wit, meeting his teasing with sharp words of her own. She was fire, unyielding, untamed, and he fell for her, though he knew he had no right to. But love was not the only force that would shape their fate. Word came to the court of Ireland that an envoy had arrived from Cornwall. King Mark, ruler of the land Tristan had once called home, was seeking a bride, and his choice had fallen upon none other than Princess Isolde. The court was divided. Some saw it as a wise alliance, a way to prevent future war between their kingdoms. Others saw it as an insult. Cornwall had slain Ireland's greatest champion, and now their king sought to take an Irish princess as his queen. Isolde's father, the King of Ireland, was cautious. He had no great love for Cornwall, but he knew that rejecting the offer might invite more bloodshed. He agreed to consider the proposal, on one condition. Whoever was to escort Isolde to Cornwall must first prove himself worthy. And so a challenge was set. In the far reaches of Ireland, a dragon had descended upon the land, a monstrous beast that had terrorized villages, burning homes, devouring livestock, and leaving nothing but death in its wake. No knight had been able to slay it. Many had tried, none had returned. The king decreed that whoever could slay the dragon would be given the honor of escorting Isolde to her future husband. Tristan's choice was clear. He had come to love Isolde, even if he could not say the words aloud. And yet, he had a duty to the king who had raised him, the uncle who had trusted him. He could not abandon his loyalty. He could not run from fate. If Isolde was to leave for Cornwall, then at the very least it would be by his hand, not some nameless knight's. And so he rode out to meet the dragon. The beast had made its lair in a ruined fortress, its body black as charred iron, eyes glowing like molten gold. Its fire had turned forests into cinders. Its claws had torn through warriors as though they were nothing. Tristan tracked it through the desolate lands, watching, waiting, studying its movements. When the battle came, it was brutal. The dragon's fire scorched the earth, its tail shattered stone, its jaws snapped with deadly precision. Tristan fought fiercely, dodging its strikes, landing blows that barely scratched its armored hide. Then at last he saw it, a small gap in the scales at the base of its neck. Summoning every ounce of strength, he leaped onto its back and drove his sword deep into the weak spot. The beast let out a final ear-splitting roar before it collapsed, shaking the very ground beneath it. Tristan stood over the beast, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat and blood. He had won. The people of Ireland hailed him as a hero. He was brought before the king, honored with feasts and celebrations. And true to his word, the king agreed. Isolde would be given to King Mark, and Tristan would be the one to escort her to Cornwall. But as the celebrations rang out, as the kingdom rejoiced, a terrible truth came to light. Isolde discovered Tristan's secret. She found the broken pieces of Morholt's sword, the very blade Tristan had used to slay her uncle. She knew then who he truly was. And for the first time, love turned to hate. She had saved the life of the man who had taken her family's greatest champion. She had healed the very knight who had doomed her kingdom to defeat. But the deal had been made. She would still go to Cornwall, and Tristan, whether she willed it or not, would be the one to take her there. But fate had something else up its sleeve. The voyage to Cornwall should have been a simple one. The dragon had been slain, the challenge met, and the King of Ireland had honored his word. Princess Isolde was to be wed to King Mark, forging a fragile peace between the two kingdoms. But the tension between Tristan and Isolde was thick, heavier than the sea mist that clung to the ship's sails. Isolde knew the truth now. She knew that the man she had nursed back to health, the knight she had laughed with, the warrior who had fought for her people, was also the one who had killed her uncle Morholt. The realization had burned through her like a blade, leaving behind anger and betrayal. Tristan, for his part, had no defense. He had done what he had to do. He had fought for his people, for his king. He had not known her then, had not known what she would come to mean to him. And yet, none of that changed the truth. None of it could erase the blood that had been spilled. They barely spoke during the journey. Isolde would not look at him, would not acknowledge him unless she had to. She was sharp when she did speak, cold and distant. And Tristan, usually so quick-witted and charming, found himself at a loss. What words could undo what had already been done? What could he say to the woman who now saw him as both her savior and her enemy? The sea stretched endlessly before them, an expanse of gray and blue that offered no answers. Day after day, they sailed toward a future neither of them wanted to face. Tristan had always been loyal to King Mark, his uncle, his protector, the man who had given him everything. But now, as he looked at Isolde, as he watched the fire in her eyes turn to something softer when she thought no one was looking, he felt the stirrings of something dangerous, something he could not afford to feel. Isolde, too, struggled. She wanted to hate him. She should have hated him. And yet, when she looked at him, the man who had fought dragons, the man who had trusted her with his life, she saw more than just her uncle's killer. She saw the same sorrow that lived within her own heart. Neither of them knew then that fate had already made its decision. A single moment, a single mistake would seal their fates forever. The night was calm, the waves lapping gently against the hull of the ship as it cut through the dark waters. The crew had settled in for the evening, the air filled with the low hum of voices and the occasional creak of wood. Somewhere below deck, a single candle flickered in the ship's galley, its light casting long shadows against the walls. It was here that it happened. The Queen of Ireland, Isolde's mother, had sent a special potion along with her daughter, a gift meant for Isolde and King Mark on their wedding night. It was no ordinary drink. This was an enchanted brew, meant to ensure undying love and devotion between the two. Once shared, it would bind them together in heart and soul, making them inseparable for all time. But the cup was never meant for Tristan. It was meant for the man who would be her husband. It was meant to solidify an alliance, to ensure peace, to guarantee that Isolde would be forever loyal to King Mark. But fate does not care for the plans of mortals. The details differ depending on who tells the story. Some say the potion was left unattended, mistaken for ordinary wine. Others claim it was a deliberate act of trickery by Isolde's handmaiden, Brangien, who had seen the growing tension between Tristan and her lady and wished to ease their burdens. But in the end, it did not matter how it happened. What mattered was that Tristan and Isolde drank. The moment the liquid touched their lips, something shifted. The world around them dulled, the sounds of the sea faded into silence, and a warmth spread through their veins, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine itself. The love they had fought to suppress, the emotions they had buried beneath duty and resentment, came rushing to the surface like a flood breaking through a dam. It was not new. It had always been there, lingering beneath every glance, every moment of silence between them. But now, it was inescapable. Their souls were bound. Tristan felt it first. A pull so strong it left him breathless, a longing so deep it was as if he had spent his entire life searching for something he did not know he had lost. He looked at Isolde, and in her eyes he saw the same realization. It was not mere attraction, not a fleeting infatuation. This was something more. something neither of them could fight. They should have stopped. They should have fought it. But how could they? Tristan had spent his life fighting battles, mastering the art of control. He had stood against warriors, faced death, and never wavered. But against this, he was powerless. Isolde, too, had always been strong-willed, sharp, and unyielding. She had planned to marry Mark out of duty, out of obligation. But now she could not imagine a life without Tristan. Their first kiss was a whisper of a mistake, a moment of surrender, a moment where they let go of reason, of honor, of everything except the undeniable truth between them. But love, once unchained, cannot be contained. They spent the rest of the journey in secret torment, trapped between devotion and betrayal. They belonged to each other, but Isolde was promised to another. Tristan had sworn loyalty to his king, and yet, no vow, no duty, no moral code could change what had already happened. By the time they reached Cornwall, they were already lost. King Mark awaited his bride with open arms, unaware that the woman he was about to marry had already given her heart to another. The court was prepared for a grand wedding, a celebration of unity between two kingdoms. But beneath the surface, a tragedy had already begun. The wedding was a spectacle of wealth and power, a grand affair meant to unite Cornwall and Ireland in peace. The great hall was filled with the scent of feasting, the glow of golden banners, and the murmurs of noble guests marveling at the beauty of Queen Isolde. But beneath the polished facade of celebration, two souls suffered in silence. Tristan stood at King Mark's side, outwardly composed, inwardly crumbling. He had done his duty, delivered Isolde as promised, yet something in him rebelled against what was happening. She was walking toward the altar, dressed in white, crowned in gold, but she was not meant for Mark. No law or title could change what was in his heart. Isolde moved through the ceremony with the grace of a queen, her face serene, her posture flawless, but her heart was a storm. She had accepted this fate, knowing she had no choice, and yet she did not belong to Mark. The love potion had bound her to Tristan in a way no earthly bond could break. She had tried to fight it, but love, once unleashed, does not wait for permission. They resisted at first. They met in fleeting moments, exchanged whispers in passing, brushed hands too briefly. But longing does not die when it is ignored. It only grows. Soon, restraint turned to fire, and they gave in, meeting in the shadows, stealing nights in secret. The rumors spread. Servants spoke of Tristan's presence lingering near the queen, of glances that lasted too long, of nights when locked doors concealed too much. One man, Sir Andre, a jealous knight who had always resented Tristan's favor in Mark's court, saw his chance. He laid a trap, waiting for the moment when the lovers would be caught. It came one night in Isolde's chambers. Tristan slipped inside as he had before, but this time torches flared, doors burst open, and a dozen knights filled the room. Tristan reached for his sword, but there was no battle to win, only judgment. Mark stood at the threshold, his face a mask of disbelief. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the words came, quiet, but heavy as a sword's edge. "Is it true?" There was no point in lying. Tristan bowed his head and said, "I have wronged you." Mark's fingers twitched toward his sword, but he did not draw it. A man he had once called a son had betrayed him, not in war, not in treason, but in something far worse. "You will leave," Mark said. The words carried more weight than any blade. "You will leave this kingdom and never return." Tristan was exiled. He had known pain, had been wounded in battle, had felt death's grip more than once, but nothing had ever hurt like this. Stripped of his home, his title, his place in the world. And worst of all, Isolde would remain behind. He left without a word, without a glance back, and Isolde, standing at the castle window, watched as he disappeared into the night, silent tears slipping down her face. Tristan rode hard, but there was nowhere to go. He had fought for Cornwall, bled for Mark, won a place at his side. Now, that life was gone. He became a knight with no banner, a warrior with no home. At first, he rode without direction, keeping ahead of any pursuers. But none came. Mark's mercy had spared him execution, but the court of Cornwall was filled with those who wished him dead. So he wandered. He lived in the wilds, sheltering in forests, sleeping beneath the stars. But a knight like Tristan could not remain unnoticed for long. Rumors of a wandering swordsman spread. He fought in tournaments under false names, sided with lords in distant battles, winning every challenge thrown his way. Wherever there was war, Tristan was there. But no victory, no coin, no title could fill the void inside him. He had left Cornwall, but his heart had never left Isolde. Back in Mark's court, Isolde wore her crown, played the role of queen, and pretended not to be dying inside. She sat beside Mark at feasts, smiled when expected, spoke when required. But at night, she stood at the castle walls, staring toward the horizon, knowing that Tristan was out there, somewhere. Mark never spoke of Tristan again. He ruled his kingdom as if nothing had happened. But Isolde saw it in his clenched fists, in the way his gaze darkened when minstrels sang of Tristan's victories. He had spared Tristan's life, but he had never forgiven him. Tristan, despite all his wandering, could not outrun the name that followed him: traitor. No king fully trusted him. No knight embraced him as a brother. In time, he sought refuge across the sea, in Brittany. And it was there that fate would intervene once more. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. Tristan had always been a warrior, but in exile he became something else: a ghost, a nameless knight who wandered from battlefield to battlefield, never staying long enough to claim glory, never fighting for anything beyond the need to move forward. It was in Brittany that he took on a new identity, donning a shield emblazoned with the image of a lion. He became known not as Tristan, the exile, the traitor, but as the Knight of the Shield with a lion. Wherever he rode, he left behind tales of his deeds, how he faced entire warbands alone, how he defeated a dozen knights in a single tournament, how his sword never faltered, no matter the odds. But no matter how many foes he bested, how many victories he won, one truth remained: he was still running. Brittany was a land of conflict, and Tristan found himself drawn into the service of its noble lords. He fought in their wars, defended their castles, and, for a time, believed he might build a new life. It was during this time that he met another woman, ironically with the same name as his love, Isolde of the White Hands. She was the sister of his lord, a noblewoman of great beauty and quiet grace. Her hair was dark, her skin pale as ivory, and her eyes carried a softness that reminded him of the sea at dusk. She was kind, gentle, and most importantly, she knew nothing of his past. To her, he was not the doomed lover of a foreign queen. He was not the traitor knight who had betrayed his king. He was simply Tristan, a warrior of great renown, a man of honor and skill. She saw in him something worth saving, a heart that had been wounded but not broken. She believed she could be the one to heal him, to fill the space in his heart that had been left hollow by grief and exile. And so she offered him her hand. Tristan hesitated. He did not love her, not in the way he had loved Isolde of Ireland. But what did love matter anymore? Love had only brought him pain. Love had cast him out, stolen his home, turned him into a man who no longer knew his place in the world. Perhaps it was time to move on. Perhaps Isolde of the White Hands was his chance to do so. And so he married her, not for love, but for the promise of peace. Isolde of the White Hands loved Tristan, but he did not love her. She saw it in the way he touched her, tender but distant. She heard it in the way he spoke, kind but never passionate. She felt it in the silence between them, in the nights when he would sit awake, staring out at the sea as though searching for something lost. She was his wife, but she was not her. Tristan did not mean to hurt her. He tried to be the husband she deserved, tried to find comfort in her arms, in her warmth. But love cannot be forced, and no matter how many times he whispered her name, his heart spoke another. Isolde of the White Hands knew, and slowly that knowledge began to fester. Years passed, but fate was not done with Tristan. One day word reached him that Cornwall was changing, that King Mark had grown weary, that his rule was no longer as strong as it had once been, that his queen, Isolde of Ireland, had grown quiet, lost in a sadness she did not speak of. Tristan did not need to hear more. He already knew what that sadness was. And so, against all reason, against all wisdom, he found himself thinking of returning. To Cornwall. To her. He did not know what he hoped to find. Perhaps he only wanted to see her one last time, to hear her voice again before fate closed the door between them forever. But fate is cruel to those who defy it, and Tristan was about to learn that some doors, once shut, should never be opened again. Though exile had cast him far from Cornwall, Tristan's legend only grew. His victories in tournaments, his triumphs in battle, and the whispered stories of the Knight of the Shield with a lion spread across Britain and beyond. It was inevitable that his name would reach Camelot, and when it did, Arthur himself sent word. Tristan was to come to court and take his rightful place among the greatest knights of the age. For all his sorrow and all his losses, Tristan had never lost his honor, and though he knew Camelot was home to King Mark's greatest allies, he could not refuse the summons of Arthur. Tristan rode into Camelot under a name that was not his own, but his reputation had already arrived before him. He expected suspicion, perhaps even rejection. But when he entered the great hall, he found something else. Respect. The Knights of the Round Table, the most powerful warriors in all of Britain, did not look upon him as an outsider. They saw him as one of their own. Even before Arthur spoke, Tristan understood. This was where he was meant to be. Arthur welcomed him with open arms. He had heard the stories, had known of Tristan's battles, of his skill, of his honor. He did not see him as a fugitive from Mark's court, nor as a knight burdened by past mistakes. He saw a man who had proven himself time and time again, a warrior who had lived by the code of chivalry, even when it cost him everything. "You belong here," Arthur told him. "If you will have us, you will sit at my table, not as a guest, but as a brother." Tristan knelt before the king, and in the sight of all he swore his loyalty. Not to Mark, not to any crown but Arthur's. And so, Tristan of Lyonesse became one of the Round Table's greatest knights. For the first time in his life, Tristan felt as though he had a home that was not bound by duty or deception. At Camelot, he was not a pawn in Mark's court. He was not the exiled lover of a forbidden queen. He was not the cursed knight who carried his sorrow like a wound that would never heal. He was simply a knight. He fought in Arthur's wars, leading the charge against invaders from the north, standing beside Gawain, Percival, and Galahad in battle. He became one of Arthur's most trusted champions, his skill in combat matched only by his wisdom and counsel. But it was not just his sword that made him beloved. Tristan was unlike the other knights. He was not only a warrior, but a musician, a poet, a man who could lift spirits with the sound of his harp, just as easily as he could strike down an enemy on the battlefield. He became the heart of the Round Table, a friend to all, a man whose laughter could ease the weight of war, whose songs could make even the most hardened warrior stop and listen. And yet, for all his joy, there was always something in his eyes, a shadow that never left him. Lancelot saw it first. Sir Lancelot had been Arthur's greatest knight before Tristan arrived, and if he was troubled by the new champion's presence, he did not show it. But the knights whispered of it. Who was the greater warrior? Who was truly the finest swordsman of Camelot? They both dismissed the talk, but deep down they knew it could not go unanswered. The duel was not born of rivalry nor of anger. It was simply a question that had to be settled. And so on a morning bathed in golden light, Tristan and Lancelot met on the training fields, their swords drawn, their shields raised. The knights of the Round Table gathered to watch, murmuring among themselves, placing wagers, arguing who would stand victorious. Even Arthur himself stood among them, though he said nothing. The battle began. Tristan fought like the wind, swift, unpredictable, never striking from the same angle twice. His swordplay was like a song, flowing and effortless, weaving together offense and defense in a way that no knight had ever seen before. Lancelot fought like a fortress, unshakable, immovable, his strength impossible to break. He was not just a warrior, but a force of nature, meeting every blow with a precision that was terrifying to behold. They fought for hours. No tricks, no distractions, just two knights pushing each other beyond their limits. Tristan's speed against Lancelot's strength, Tristan's cunning against Lancelot's discipline. Again and again they clashed, but neither could find the upper hand. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they both struck at once, swords halting just inches from each other's throats. Silence fell over the field, and then, laughter. The two knights lowered their blades, breathing hard, grinning like brothers who had finally recognized themselves in each other. There was no winner, there was no loser. There were only two legends standing side by side. From that day on, Tristan and Lancelot were not rivals. They were allies, bound by respect, by skill, by an understanding that no one else in the world could share. Tristan never spoke of his past, but Lancelot did not need to ask. He saw the way Tristan turned away when lovers danced at the feasts. He saw the way his hands lingered on the harp strings, as if trying to put into music something he could not say in words. And Tristan, in turn, saw the same sorrow in Lancelot's eyes whenever Guinevere passed. They never spoke of it. They never had to. They both understood what it meant to love someone they could never have. For all his skill, for all his victories, for all his triumphs in battle, Tristan was still a man who carried a wound that would never heal. And in time, that wound would call him back to the place he had spent years trying to forget. Back to Cornwall. Back to Isolde. Tristan had spent years in exile, wandering from one adventure to the next, trying to lose himself in the clamor of tournaments, the thrill of battle, and the quiet moments of solitude in the wild. But no matter how far he traveled or how many songs he played on his harp, Isolde was never far from his thoughts. Then, one day, word reached Tristan of something strange. In the court of a distant king, there was said to be a dog of rare beauty and unnatural power. Its fur was white as fresh snow, its eyes like liquid gold, and it carried with it a magic unlike any other. Whoever possessed the creature would know only joy, their heart untouched by sorrow. It was a gift from the Fae, a creature of enchantment that could banish grief, no matter how deep. When Tristan heard this, he knew what he had to do. He did not want the dog for himself. His suffering was his own burden to carry. But Isolde, trapped in King Mark's court, bound to a man she did not love, perhaps she could find some comfort. If he could not be with her, then at least he could send her something that might ease her pain. The dog belonged to a powerful king, one whose land stretched far across the kingdom of Wales. The king, hearing of Tristan's reputation, agreed to a wager. If Tristan could hunt down and slay a fierce beast that had plagued his lands, the fairy hound would be his reward. The beast was no ordinary quarry. It was said to be a monstrous boar, larger than any man, with tusks that could cut through armor and a hide too thick for any blade to pierce. It had torn through villages, trampled knights who dared to face it, and left the countryside in terror. Many had tried to slay it, and all had failed. But Tristan was no ordinary knight. He tracked the beast through the forests and valleys, following the destruction it left in its wake. He found shattered trees where it had crashed through the woods, deep gouges in the earth where it had torn at the ground in fury. Then finally he heard it, a deep rumbling breath, the sound of hooves pounding the soil, and the guttural snarl of something ancient and wild. The beast emerged from the shadows, massive and terrible. Its hide was dark as iron, its eyes red with fury. It charged with the force of a warhorse, tusks gleaming like curved daggers. Tristan did not hesitate. He moved swiftly, dodging to the side, his sword flashing in the fading light. The battle was brutal. The boar was stronger than any beast he had faced, and even his sword could not cut deep enough to bring it down. Again and again he struck, and again the monster raged. It took every ounce of Tristan's strength, every ounce of his skill, but in the end, he found the opening he needed. With a final strike, he drove his blade between the beast's ribs, piercing its heart. It let out one last thunderous roar before collapsing, shaking the earth as it fell. Bloodied but victorious, Tristan returned to the king, the head of the monstrous boar at his feet. True to his word, the king gifted him the fairy hound. Tristan could not bring the dog to Isolde himself, for he was still exiled from Cornwall. Instead, he entrusted it to a messenger, one who could deliver it in secret. Along with the hound, he sent no letters, no words, only a single token, a remembrance of their love. When Isolde received the dog, she understood immediately. She knew who had sent it, and why. But though the magic of the hound was said to bring joy, it could not banish the sorrow that weighed on her heart. The dog lay at her feet, its golden eyes watching her, but she did not smile. For what good was a gift of happiness when the one who had given it was still so far away? Tristan had tried to give her peace, but love does not fade with time, nor does sorrow simply vanish. She held the dog close, whispered Tristan's name, and wondered if they would ever meet again. For all his skill, all his victories, and all the songs sung in his name, Tristan was never meant to find peace. His life had been a cycle of love and loss, triumph and exile, passion and pain. No matter how far he traveled, how many battles he won, or how fiercely he tried to bury his longing, fate was never finished with him. Years had passed since he last saw Isolde. The weight of time had settled over him like a heavy cloak, but his heart remained unchanged. He had fought for kings, defended the weak, and lived the life of a wandering knight. He had done all he could to distract himself, to keep moving so he would not have to think of what he had lost. But in the end, time catches up to all men, even the greatest among them. During a battle in Brittany, Tristan once again found himself face to face with death. He fought bravely as he always had, but this time fate delivered its final blow. An enemy knight, one whose name would be lost to time, struck Tristan down with a poisoned blade. The wound was deep, and though Tristan managed to slay his attacker, he knew immediately that this was different. The pain burned through him like fire, seeping into his blood. No healer could cure him. No magic could undo what had been done. The poison worked slowly, weakening him day by day. There was only one person in the world who might be able to save him: Isolde of Ireland. She had healed him once before when he had been near death from Morholt's blade. Perhaps she could do it again. Desperate, Tristan sent a messenger to sail to Ireland. He gave him clear instructions. If Isolde agreed to come, the ship's sails would be white. If she refused, they would be black. And then all he could do was wait. As Tristan lay in bed, his strength fading with each passing day, his wife, Isolde of the White Hands, watched over him. She had always known he did not love her. Not truly. His heart had never belonged to her, and though he had tried to be a good husband, he was never fully hers. And now, even as he was dying, he did not call for her. The jealousy burned within Isolde of the White Hands like a slow, cold rage. She had spent years knowing she was only a shadow in his heart, and now, at the end, he still longed for another. Then, the day came when the ship appeared on the horizon. A servant ran to Isolde of the White Hands and told her the news. The sails were white. Isolde of Ireland had come. She had not abandoned Tristan. She was racing to his side, ready to save him, as she had once done before. But Isolde of the White Hands did not tell him the truth. Instead, she stood by his bedside, looked into his fevered, longing eyes, and whispered, "The sails are black." She saw the light in his eyes flicker, saw his hope drain away like water slipping through open hands. Tristan let out a quiet sigh, a final breath of sorrow. "Then it is over," he murmured. With Isolde's name on his lips, he closed his eyes and died. Moments later, the real Isolde arrived. She rushed to his side, breathless from the journey, her heart pounding with hope and fear. But when she saw him lying still, his body lifeless, his hands cold, she knew she was too late. She fell to her knees beside him, grief overtaking her. "He died thinking I had abandoned him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The weight of that thought crushed her. The love they had fought so hard for had been stolen from them in the cruelest way. Some say she held his hand and whispered his name one last time. Others say she leaned over and kissed his lips, as if to wake him from the eternal sleep he had slipped into. But no matter what words were spoken, no matter what final act of love she tried to give, her heart could not bear the loss. And so Isolde collapsed beside him and died of grief. Their love had defied kingdoms, outlasted exile, and withstood betrayal. But in the end, it could not conquer fate. When news of their deaths reached Cornwall, King Mark was overcome with sorrow. He had once condemned Tristan for his betrayal, but in the end, he understood. He had seen the love they shared, and he knew now that they had never truly belonged to anyone but each other. He ordered that Tristan and Isolde be buried side by side, so that even in death they would not be separated. But even that was not the end. Legends say that from Tristan's grave a great briar grew, its thorns twisting and stretching across the ground until they reached Isolde's grave. No matter how many times it was cut back, it always grew again, uniting them forever. A love that could not live in this world had found its place in the next.